As we convene this evening, Israel's Independence Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, has concluded in Israel, but we may still wish each other Chag Sameach. Atzmaut is a modern Hebrew word derived from the old words etzem for self and otzma for strength. To become strong and skilled enough to take care of yourself is indeed an important accomplishment in life. Independence is sweetest, however, when it means not only escape from the clutches of oppression, but also the pursuit of righteousness and justice, tzedek umishpat, as a responsible person and as a people. This is true in Israel, and it is also so for the Jewish community in America. To become independent and to create communities that strengthen society by their pursuit of righteousness and justice, we require skilled and dedicated leaders. Yet skill and dedication are not sufficient, not in a rapidly changing world. The ancient rabbis asked, "Who is wise? Ezehu chacham?" And they answered, "It is a person who can anticipate what comes next, haro'eh et hanolad." This is our purpose tonight, to introduce you to 4 extraordinary changemakers, JTS ordained rabbis who are leading in 4 sectors of Jewish life: congregations, K-12 education, college campuses, and federations. Of course, no panel can represent every aspect of rabbinic work or reflect the full diversity of identities of our colleagues across the world. JTS is so proud to promote the sacred work of its rabbis, cantors, educators, scholars, and other leaders who are Jews of color, LGBTQI, and those working in fields such as academia, camping, chaplaincy, and so much more. We celebrate the diversity of our students and our alumni and are delighted to present 4 of our finest to you tonight. So let me introduce our illustrious panelists. To do them justice would take all of our time, so please forgive my brevity. Rabbi Sharon Brous is the founder and senior rabbi of Ikar, a congregation in Los Angeles. Rabbi Menachem Creditor is scholar in residence at UJA-Federation of New York, founder of Rabbis Against Gun Violence, and author of A Rabbi's Heart. Rabbi Mitch Malkus is head of school at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School of Greater Washington, D.C. And Rabbi Julie Roth is the executive director at the Center for Jewish Life at Princeton, and she's the Jewish chaplain at Princeton University. Welcome to you, my distinguished colleagues and friends. So I would like to begin just by checking in with you. How are you doing? It has been a crazy 14 months of pandemic, and I'd like to hear how you're doing, and if you could give us a brief example of how this experience has changed your work as a rabbi. And I'm going to call on Rabbi Julie Roth to start us off.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor to be in this conversation. It's forced me to think past the question of the very moment, which is the question I've been in basically since the pandemic hit, whatever that question might be, to what's after. And so I really appreciate that. How am I doing? I am tired. It has been an exhausting and stressful journey. I'm curious. I'm 1 vaccine in. I can see the end in sight. What's it going to be like? I'm really curious about that. And on a personal level, I'm also very grateful and joyful. I'm grateful to be healthy. I'm grateful to be alive. And I'm joyful to be celebrating my twin son's B'nai Mitzvah in just a week and a half.
Shatova.
The work has changed in so many ways, but I'll just give one example. We were never in the summer internship business before. And then last year, 2 weeks before the semester ended, we found out that so many college students had lost their summer plans, whether they were studying or they had these great internships. We basically reached into our Rolodex of alumni and set up very quickly internships for over 25 students. Maybe the most exciting ones, an example would be students went to Peru to help communicate about COVID to people living in the Amazon. And another student worked for the NIH in France. And so we just found ourselves hearing a new need from students and doing our best to be agile and to respond in the moment.
Thank you. Rabbi
and I'll pass it on
Go ahead, please.
We call this popcorn style on campus. I'll pass it on to Mitch.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Danny and JTS for inviting me to participate. I'm really excited, and I'm excited to also learn from my colleagues on the call and see what's going on in your world. So I echo what Julie said, that it's an exhausting year or year and a half, and so many challenges. I like to think someone ripped out the manual on pandemics, ripped out the chapter on pandemics in my training manual. And I liked, Danny, I appreciated the way you introduced this in terms of looking forward, but one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that when we had to abruptly close the school and then 3 days later open up in virtual learning, I thought that would be for 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and then we'd be back in session. And now it seems kind of naive to think about it that way. But one of the things that I've really felt a lot is what Julie mentioned, is a lot of gratitude to people in our community, a lot of connection, even though we're not physically together, but feeling a lot of connection. And in terms of the things that have changed, I would say that 2 things I want to mention. One is that I never realized how important in-person learning is for children K to 12, and how important it is for their families, not just for them, but for their families. And then the second thing that's changed is that a whole host of opportunities of connecting with people outside of the school has opened up in ways that I hope we'll explore in the future. So Sharon, how are you doing?
Hi, Mitch. Thank you. So first of all, let me also just echo the gratitude for being here and being part of this conversation. And thank you to you, Danny, and to the whole team at JTS for thinking to bring us all together. And it's great to see my friends and my colleagues and so many people who are really grappling with and wrestling with what we've learned from this and what kind of future we might be able to build together. Yeah, it's been a lot to hold this past year. And I was just thinking the other day about an executive coach that I had maybe 1 or 2 years into building Ikar, who had this word of advice to me. She said, at some point, every member of the clergy needs to decide if they are pastor or prophet, because you cannot do both and live. And the reason I'm thinking about it now is because, in fact, so much of the reality of our work is that we are living in multiple worlds at once and multiple realities at once. And I think COVID made this supremely clear. I don't remember asking anyone how they're doing over the last year without hearing some version of, personally, I'm okay, thank God, the world is falling apart. Or, I'm really grateful for the time with my children, but really, really worried about what's happening in a broader context. And so I think that we are actually called to be present to both of those needs, to the kind of love and care on the home front and concern for and pastoral care for those in our immediate circles. And also this moment has absolutely called us to contemplate and to consider what moral leadership must look like in a time of complete and utter upheaval. And I think that that's been one of the great challenges of this time. And it's also been one of the great offerings of clarity for us. And so I feel that I'm spending all of my heart giving love, trying to give love and care and response to illness, death, isolation, worry on the home front in our immediate community, and all of my time and effort and heart to also trying to address these broader conflicts and crises, compounding crises of our time. And so when you're giving everything you have in 2 places at once, it makes you feel like every day is a double blessing, because you get to do that in both contexts. But that's how I'm doing. I'd love a vacation, wouldn't we all?
Well, I'll jump in, and first of all, give so much love to my colleagues. And I was scanning how many hundreds of people who've influenced my life personally are on this call. So JTS is a convening power for teachers and colleagues and friends and classmates and a cappella friends, and my parents, I think, are here. So I just want to say what a ball of love this conversation is, and to hear the personal, just the voices of my friends, and to hear how we're doing. I mean, Sharon, 2.5 years ago when you married my wife and me, could we have imagined this world that unfolded between then and now? And to reflect what you said, you know, I'm fine. I've never been so aware of the blessings in my life. And I feel so connected to this ravaged world of ours. It's so hard to feel so okay and not okay. So depending on the hour someone asks me, either I'm a puddle on the floor, or I'm trying to take care of somebody else, trying to remember that I exist, trying to figure out how to safely do the next thing that I need to do. And just a few days ago, when my second vaccine kicked in all the way, I just jumped in a car and drove to my parents. And I've never felt so tended to. And I've never realized how deeply I needed to feel that too. So in the ways that this has transformed my work, which, I mean, I don't know what's bigger than a person's heart, but my work, which I feel very much is a manifestation of who I am in the world, has led me to reach out further than I've ever reached out before. And so with UJA-Federation's willingness, we created a broadcast every morning, and I helped create a new pulpit. And I don't know how to define it. I don't know who's a member, and I don't know why anyone should or shouldn't be welcome. And that feels like a new way of being together with people. And I want us to dance together. I want us to be in person. And I never would have been able to be so near so many people had we not been so thrust into this moment. So I want to offer my whole heart, which I can't quite define. I think I'm okay. Right now, maybe I'm fine. I'm so grateful to see all of you sweet people here. And I want it to be better for everybody, the way that I feel the parts of my life are okay. I want that to be a universal truth.
Amen. All right, so thank you everybody for sharing. And I think a lot of us feel a bit of a paradox that things are both dreadful and wonderful in some ways. And if I could just say a word on behalf of the school here, you know, it's wonderful that we have students who are now living all over the world. I've got rabbinical students at JTS taking New York-based JTS classes, living in Berlin and in Jerusalem and all over this continent. That's a lovely thing. It's a tragic thing too, because, you know, the Talmud says, uproot yourself and go to a place of Torah. And there was a reason for that. Being together in a Beit Midrash, an actual room, and having Shabbat meals together and walks in the park together and crying on each other's shoulder. I mean, the things that we take for granted have now become so distant and so hard to imagine. And so I want to transition to my second question, which is trying to imagine what's around the corner. You know, Julie mentioned a partial vaccination. Some of us are double vaxxed by now. Some of us are still waiting for our first jab. Some of us have communities which are already beginning to transition to more in-person activity. And Mitch, I certainly think that's true mostly in the day school world. But I'm curious, as you try to look ahead to the summer, to the fall, what do you anticipate it being like? Are there things that we've learned, skills that we've learned in this pandemic that we need to retain and need to become just part of our normal way of being? But are there other things that you can't wait to turn off the Zoom and just to be doing in person again? So what's your anticipation of what's ahead of us? And we'll go in a different order. I'll start by calling on Mitch this time first.
So I'll tell you in a broad sense what we've seen, you know, my experience in the day school world and at my school, and I think it's been similar at schools all around the country. So in a broad sense, in day school level, we've seen more emphasis and a pretty clear consensus that in-person education, at least for K to 12, is really critical and essential. And it's critical and essential for the students, but it's also critical and essential for families. You know, at the youngest ages, students need their teachers. They need them in person for quality and engaged experience, but they need them for social and emotional support in ways that no matter how good we can do the virtual learning, we just cannot replicate what can happen in person. And I think their parents who have work obligations and family obligations, as much as they care deeply about a rich education, they also do need, and we have to be practical about the childcare aspects. And so that's something that we've been thinking a lot. At the older grades, though, I would say we've found that content delivery or learning, that can be really engaged for older students. And students are taking more ownership for their own learning. They're certainly collaborating using technology outside of the classroom, and we're using a lot of technology across the grade. So there's a lot of positives in terms of that. We've also seen that for some students, a lot of the anxiety of coming into school and kind of social anxieties that they've experienced have dissipated during this time. And so being able to learn online has been really valuable for them. But by and large, I think that one of the things we found in the day school world is that the richness of the social connections, the richness of the activities that we do, not just the intellectual learning that we do, that's something that was really lost or is lost in the virtual environment, and why it's so important that we be together. I'll share one example of something that's been great that I'm thinking about. How do you bring this with us? So a perennial question in schools, and I know even in synagogues everywhere, is how do you engage people in authentic, meaningful prayer? That's sometimes a little more difficult for middle school students and certainly high school students who are asserting their independence. And we had an instructor in the school. We were trying, how do you do this virtually, particularly in a situation where of all the activities, singing and davening is probably the one that we can't do in person together. And how do you engage students if you have to do this virtually? So he had a wonderful idea, and he didn't know what would happen, but he said, what if every week we davened in a different synagogue in the world? Maybe one week we'll be in Turkey, and another week we'll be in Greece, and another week we'll be in Israel. And let's learn about those synagogues where we're davening, and let's meet the people in those communities who bring vibrancy to that part of the world. And it also is an opportunity to add diversity to what our understanding of what it means to be Jewish in the 21st century, and what it's like to be in a small community versus a larger community. And so what happens is the virtual background ends up being a synagogue somewhere in the world. And then we've connected with rabbis all around the world in those communities who have actually agreed to come and speak to our students in the Washington, D.C. area. And that has been incredible. And it's been a great opportunity to connect in ways that we never thought we would be able to do. So I think there are huge opportunities, despite the fact that, I think the importance of learning that we need to be in person to reach our goals, but we can enrich what we're doing by expanding the universe of people who we're in touch with.
Remember, you're calling on, and I will call on Rabbi Brous.
I love that idea, by the way, Mitch. It's a really beautiful way to make the world feel smaller. And I feel like that's part of what ironically has happened during this time. I mean, on one hand, this little tiny virus, which spread to every single inch of the earth, showed us how incredibly connected we are to each other. And also, because of the virus, we've had to be in isolation from one another. And so there's a really interesting tension in this time. And so, we've learned a lot. We have, like everybody else, you kind of wrestled with what it would look like to move a community that is halachically serious into an entirely virtual space for an entire year. And I can tell you that for me personally, this was extremely challenging. I haven't opened a computer or a phone on Shabbat in, I don't know, 25 years. And then when the pandemic came, we had our amazing Cantor music director was holding that space on Shabbat for about an hour each Shabbat morning. And I realized when Yisker came, when we got to Pesach last year, that we had essentially spent 18 years building a community of people who could learn how to cry together and grieve together and hold memory together. And I couldn't be in a position where I was saying to them, like, you're going to have to do that without without your rabbis for as long as it might be. And this was when it was becoming clear it wasn't going to be a few weeks, but instead at least a year. And so we have transitioned, which has been both challenging and also wonderful. Our community has grown in ways that really have surprised me. We have people davening with us every Shabbos from all over the world. But what's really interesting is we have members now, like people who've joined Ikar as members from London and from Chile and from Japan, and lots of people from different places in the United States, which I've been really fascinated by, because I'm trying to understand what would make someone pay for something that they could get for free, because it's all online and it's all being streamed. And so we've done these small group gatherings with our people, because part of it, the question of this time is, how do you build intimacy when you're only engaging each other virtually? And what people say is that they really want to be part of a community of shared purpose. And it's very clear that in this time where people are feeling increasingly untethered from the world, that we want to be connected to each other. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about just figuring out how to be alive in a time of moral crisis, that people are really searching for their people. Who are you standing on the same side of history with? And how can we collectively lift our voices to build a more just and loving society and a more equitable future? And so I think that what's happened now is our sense of community has grown really significantly. And that's going to be an interesting transition as we begin to think about reopening now. And for us, it's going to be in a couple of weeks that we're going to be able to come back together in person on Friday night and Shabbat morning. It'll be small group, and then it's going to grow. But so we have this whole community now out there in the world that's now coming to us every single Shabbat. And so how do we continue to be in people's lives and supportive of and building community out there and in here all at the same time? I think that the power of relationships is not to be underestimated in this time. And I think that there's been real spiritual and psychic damage done from all of this trauma and loss. And it's not just the loss of COVID. It's the multiple compounding crises. It's the crisis of racial injustice. It's the crisis of seeing another unarmed Black man killed while on the phone with his mother, while we're in the context of and only a few miles from the Derek Chauvin trial. It's the crisis of the environment, and knowing that the fire season is coming here soon again in California, and just seeing these, the horror of these floods and hurricanes and fires. And I mean, there's so many competing and compounding crises. And I think there is a psychic and a spiritual price to be paid for those who are awake in this time. And so for us to do everything in our power to build and hold and sustain relationships of meaning and purpose with people in this time is absolutely the most essential question that I think we're facing in this day. So that's a little bit of how we're holding this, and there are going to be lots of questions to answer in the days ahead. Menachem, I'm curious how you are finding this time.
How do I follow you, my friend? Part of how I'm finding this is that my needs have shrunk. I think about the musical that's very precious in my family, the Rothschilds. I don't know if anyone knows it. Never made it really big, but there's this one song in the middle of the play, one room, that's all I really want, a place to lay my head and to be with you. This is where I live. This is my space. And I like it. I've come to really enjoy the smallness of it. And so, Danny's original question, I think, was, what about the summer and what? I just want to be here, and I want to feel okay. And I want to take one step at a time, one, small footstep, trying to find my next safe space. How far can I go before I stop feeling okay and tethered? And there's a new umbilical cord, at least for me, to my home. And I'm very grateful for it. And I'm hyper aware of it. And the idea of getting on a plane right now, even though I know, statistically speaking, it might be safer than other modes of travel right now, it's not something I'm ready to do. And I was doing it quite a lot before. I wonder how that impacts what we need for our corporate businesses. My work with UJA has me in touch with so many different spaces that are not occupied right now. We are all home showing our real backgrounds or virtual backgrounds, but we're much more aware that our internet will go out, and that's okay. And a child is going to come close, and that's perfect. And life is messy, and that's great. So this, anodized cellophane life that so many of us have thought we were supposed to try to live, I hope we discard for good. And the impact of that should be a better distribution of the means that we used to allocate for office space that largely was unoccupied while people were asleep on the street. So in my small way, my smaller needs and my time with my children, I've never been so aware of how small my world really needs to be for me to feel okay. What does that mean about the summer? It means if we're lucky and our plans are for each of them to go to different camps Ramah, I don't know what my world is going to feel like anymore. I used to understand that a little bit better. So maybe we're just becoming more human, and maybe that's a really good thing to hold on to. And the more aware I can be of my own small space and the little room that's all I really need, maybe the more invested I can be in everyone having just a small room where they can be and get what they need. I think we need to be aware that whatever we're feeling, you and I are in such a position of privilege. We have the space and the time to be on this beautiful conversation, the equipment with which to engage in it, the internet that provides it for us. What an amazing realization of how privileged I am and the ravages of the world that feel far away and feel so within me. So I think the world is vibrating quite a lot. And they say in the Talmud that prophecy, once the temple was destroyed, was given to foolish people and to children. So foolish people, I might not listen to, but I will ask my children about the future because they probably understand it better than I do. So I'm going to hand it to Julie. I'm so curious, given who you work with in your community, how you process all of this.
Well, Menachem, I can definitely relate to what you were saying about who knows about the summer. Last summer, I actually looked up on Amazon, do they sell crystal balls? I was thinking of purchasing a crystal ball as a gift to the Dean of Religious Life, who I basically email every day to say, are students coming back on campus? And then finally the university said that they were, and then they canceled it in the fall, and then they came back, in the spring, and they're also all over the world. And so I'm just very aware, because I didn't buy it, they do sell them, by the way, that I do not have a crystal ball. And I think beyond anything else I could say, the most important thing I want to carry forward is the skill of agility and deep listening. We were already oriented towards experimentation in college. We have, new students every 4 years. We're at the cutting edge of the most diverse cross-section of Jewish life in America. But even so, we had to double down on our deep listening skills and our agility skills. We have a dining hall that seats usually 150 people. The university told us we had a capacity of 11 for the spring. 11 people in the dining hall. How do you do Shabbat dinner? Last year, we had 1,000 students come through our doors for Shabbat dinner before the pandemic. And although it's tiring, right? It's also sharpening that muscle that allows me to say, what do students need in this moment? And also at home, what do I need? What does my family need? And then to try, put together a scrappy prototype, have a Passover Seder online and invite alumni and see what happens, So agility and deep listening to understand what people need beneath the surface is first and foremost. But kind of more concretely, if I was to guess, if I was to look into the crystal ball, what do I think it would say? I think it would say that our communities are going to continue to be both local and global. For Sharon, maybe that means, global membership, and maybe Mitch's students will daven all over the world, and Menachem will have a radio station show. But for us, local means what do I want more than anything? I want to open Marnie's office and see 4, 5, 6 students sitting on the couch and another 6 or 7 sitting on the floor. And I want to see students stuffed in the building. I'm so happy that right now we have 50 students in shifts having an outdoor barbecue on our lawn in celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut. But we don't really have as much local or as proximate local community as I would like. But local and global allows me to be on this call and for them to be having the barbecue at the same time. And I think globally what we've seen is that Hillel nationally has created an online platform called Hillel at Home, where our local Jewish Latinx group can invite Rolly Matalone from BJ in New York City to talk about the Jewish Latin experience in America. And they can be joined not just by Jewish Latino students from all over the country, but also from South America. And then not only are hundreds of people watching it live, but thousands are able to watch it asynchronously afterwards. Like there are like, maybe 20, 25 Jewish Latinx students at Princeton, but there's not that many Jews from an Asian background or Jews from an African-American background. And if you kind of put them together nationally, you have the potential to create a sense of global community. My colleague at Drexel, Isabel Tekanik, says, I'll be your queer rabbi if you'll be my Russian-speaking mentor, meaning she's a queer rabbi. She can do a fellowship for queer Jews around the country, but she only has a few Russian-speaking Jews and she doesn't speak Russian. So I think there's a powerful way in which, in the Hillel network, but I think for all of us in our own ways, we can bring together marginalized groups in larger gatherings online, also with leaders that represent their particular backgrounds and interests. And so I definitely think we should keep being both local and global, much more local than we're able to be now, but also global. And that we're going to have to continue to focus on wellness. I was just in a meeting with my fellow chaplains, and the dean said that the campus psychological services has not only seen a tremendous influx of students needing mental health support, but they anticipate it will be several years before it goes back to normal levels. And so I know it personally from my own family and from the students I connect with that all of us but some more than others have had our mental health frayed during this time. And our Hillel and Hillels around the country are saying, how must wellness become as central a pillar to what we do as Shabbat and holidays, social justice in Israel?
Every one of those answers was so rich that we could follow up. Just even on the last point you made, Julie, about wellness, I'm sure you're talking in a school setting, you're talking in a federation community, and certainly in the synagogue, and certainly in the seminary, issues of wellness and of anxiety and isolation and stress are very strong for all of us. And the paradox, of course, as you noted, is we can find new resources with this technology, but they don't quite compensate for what we've lost, which is presence, physical presence. The example of Marnie's office, which is empty right now, or almost empty, maybe one person. There are a lot of people putting questions to me in the chat. I'm trying to look at them, but the reality is that this isn't really going to be, we're not going to be able to call on people or to read a lot of questions, but because we have a few others here, and as you can tell, each of our speakers has so much to say. But Rabbi Brous, in her answer, talked about some of the larger social issues that were always in the background in America, but have sort of burst into the foreground now, issues of racial inequity and the climate crisis, and general inequity in our society, as some people have experienced this crisis as a time to enjoy their first and second homes, in some cases third homes, and seeing their stock portfolios do great, and other people have lost everything. And so I'm wondering how your organizations, really quite specifically, are contending with some of these very dramatic issues that that somehow we're giving more attention to at this time of crisis. So I don't know, I lost track of who I started with us. I think Menachem, you haven't started yet, so we'll go with you.
Thanks, Danny. UJA-Federation of New York is, I didn't know this when I started, is the largest local philanthropy in the world. And when you're involved in that kind of scale and scope of organization, especially when it comes to a donor community, rarely do you go off script. And so one of the things that this moment has really prompted, because of the immediacy of injustice everywhere in the air, and since there is no one place that is beyond you, meaning every there is right here, because of how we experience each other, we've been much more responsive in the world and much more attuned to the personal lives of our donors, the relationships that have always been the bedrock of what we do in the world. The going off script has become very important. It's a hard thing to navigate, but for instance, I teach a lot of affinity-based groups, and sometimes it's based on industry, sometimes it's based on geography. The biggest and most popular group right now is working through this book, which I know Sharon has also led a beautiful conversation with the author, Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, has become some of the deepest Torah I've taught this year. And I daven James Baldwin over Pesach, meaning there's something about the way we learn. And for me, that happened because my library is locked away at 59th and Lex. And all of a sudden, I was aware that my library really wasn't representative. Now, if that's true in one part of our organizational work, and at least it's what pours through me, then our DEI work and our diversity work and our work as a Jewish philanthropy on behalf of Jews in a world where your neighbor's welfare is literally your life or death. Everything has changed because of the immediacy of the world. So in terms of, what we do, fundraising, we recognize that our agencies and partner organizations are writhing right now because of the shifts in federal allocations over the last number of years. Our social service agencies cannot keep up with the increased needs, which means we must recognize that political engagement is a Jewish mandate if we are to fulfill the cardinal rule of loving our neighbors as ourselves. So over and over, I think that organizationally, what's happening for us is, I hope what's happening for us individually as people too, which is we are suddenly actually more aware that our neighbors' welfare matters. So I think it's both practical, it's organizational, and it might even be a synthesis of the mission we said we cared about all along, being brave enough to open our doors eventually to meet our neighbors and to do something for them, and to recognize that we have just as much needs, just as many needs as they do. And maybe when I open my door, someone will be there to take care of me too if I'm lucky. So that's the big shift, at least that I feel organizationally and personally. I feel it's one and the same. And I'm actually curious because I just, the panelists know I just picked up one of my kids from day school where somehow it's working physically. I don't quite get it, and how things move forward. Mitch, I'm so curious how culturally and organizationally you felt these shifts too.
You're on mute, Mitch.
As long as it wasn't me who did that first.
We have these great mugs that we gave out as gifts to the faculty that say you're on mute. Something we're all learning. So Menachem, I love the way that you spoke about the need to go off script. And by the way, I think we've all been forced in every part of our lives to have to pivot and then repivot and reset so many times. So, at the day school level, we had started work in DEI, but I think what's happened is we're experiencing two pandemics, right? There's the health crisis with the associated economic fallout, but there's also the pandemic in our nation in terms of the values of our country and where we stand on all of these things. And I will tell you, one of the wonderful things of having such a large alumni network is that our alumni reach out and want to know, what are you doing in these areas? How are you addressing racial injustice? How are you addressing wealth inequalities? How are the students learning to think about these topics in serious ways? And also confronting history, right? And learning from history and trying to understand those better. So we have actually increased that work, despite the fact that we have to focus in on how do we get as many students into the building every day? How can we do that in a safe way? we can't put aside the urgency of this moment in those areas. So specifically, I think that the contribution of schools can be a question about democratic education, because there's a breakdown in society of our ability to talk to each other. And this is what, Julie, I heard you saying as well, around listening. One of the wonderful things that's happened is that there's been a lot more give and take between families in the school and what are their challenges and the school itself. We've had town halls almost every month to try to answer questions, but really engage in conversation. And so, you know, at our school, there's a diversity of opinion. There are people who say to me, well, does systemic racism exist? There are people who question a lot of things. And as an educational institution, what I'm interested in is fostering dialogue, civil discourse, teaching students and scaffolding for them how to do this work. And we're starting to engage with a lot of partners in this work to try to teach students not just how to understand complexities in our world, but how to discuss these and to develop their own opinions. And I would say it hits home as well when we talk about discourse on Israel. How are we going to have that conversation in our community? So there's a lot of urgency, and I'm worried about the breakdown in our civil society, and thinking about you know, what used to be civic education and what the role schools have to play in fostering much more dialogue, and also a much more strong spirit and commitment to listening to others. I think we have great models in our tradition, in our Jewish tradition, of different ways of interpretation. If we look at the Talmud, we know that different schools of thought couldn't get along, but their families had social relationships, right? And married, even if they thought very differently about different really significant issues. So those are the things that we're thinking about in the school, and wanting really to think about diversity and equity and inclusion in much more serious ways in the school than we have in the past. I'm actually interested because our alumni have engaged in this as well from their experiences on campus. Julie, what are you seeing in this area, and what are the trends, and how are you trying to address these really urgent issues?
So I think as a Hillel director and as a Jewish chaplain at the university, what's unique about my position is that I run a Jewish community embedded in a very diverse university community. That's kind of inherent to Hillel work. And so I'm part of a diversity and inclusion network within the university where I'm representing the Jewish point of view and listening to colleagues all across the ethnic, racial, orientation, gender spectrum talk about their work, both on the campus life side and on the academic side. So first, my context is very different, but then I have very overlapping experiences. In terms of Menachem, what you were saying, I also personally did both a lot of reading myself and a lot of book group discussions, both with our college students and with Zamru, this indie minion I run in the Princeton community. And I just found a lot of people who were earnestly asking, I thought I cared about the Black Lives Movement, you know, the last time it was very live in our country, but it seems the same. And last time I would just say, well, I'm not a racist. And so what does it really mean to be an anti-racist? And really saw people go through a process of reckoning and transformation within these kind of self-selective reading groups. And I remember for myself also in the fall leading a class on race and justice, one of our many learning fellowships, with two student interns, one of who was a Jew who's white passing, and another Jew who is a Jew of color. And just for me, the experience of teaching for the first time alongside of Jew of color around the issues of race and justice, I really had to think differently about things that I was accustomed to saying, not necessarily racist things, just things that assume that my experience as a white Jew is the Jewish experience, you know? So it's been a real learning process for me. And then I also confront what Mitch kind of alluded to. I have alumni and students of very broad backgrounds. It's not selective here politically. We really range from very progressive to very conservative in the larger Princeton family. And I have alumni from California worried about the Californian ethnic studies curriculum and how that impacts Jewish identity. And it's really hard to figure out how to make space for Jews to talk about our own identities in terms of being white and not being white, not all being white, talk about anti-Semitism, talk about being on the learning curve, talk about all of this, and also be actually wrestling with the legacy that we've inherited of privilege and doing something to change it, but being able to actually find space to wrestle honestly. And so I find that the other reason I'm perhaps lucky is that President Eisgruber, the president of Princeton University, has made anti-racist initiatives a major university-wide priority and really held the entire university at the highest levels accountable for plans around this. And so I'm part of this larger momentum in this university environment to think about those things, which helps me that I don't have to do it alone. But it's also complicated to navigate that Jewishly. Princeton's very proud to have just admitted its most diverse ever class, with 68% of the American students being students of color. Well, given how few Jews there are of color in America, that means that we might have diminishing numbers of Jewish students at Princeton. And so I think we have to figure out, at least in my position, how to do the internal work in the Jewish community and the partnership work in the larger community, and also how to get out of the university bubble and to actually work on issues like mass incarceration and other issues that are happening not really directly in the university, even though we have students at the university volunteering in the prisons, and even if our Hillel is studying about the connections between mass incarceration and the Passover Seder and another fellowship, we have to be thinking not only about talking and learning, but also about what actions we can take. And I think that's a perfect segue for Sharon, my colleague, who inspires me every day in her prophetic voice and in her commitment to leading not only the Ikar.
Thank you, Julie. It's really good to hear the way that you're thinking about all of this. And I think it's clear that, what's happening on the college campus is having such a profound impact on the community. And so I'm grateful for the deep thought that is going into your work there. And the students are really lucky to have you. I am thinking, as we're speaking, about a speech that Dr. King gave, I think it was in 1965 in Oberlin. It was a commencement address in which he spoke about Rip Van Winkle. You might remember this speech, but he said that, we often tell and retell the story of Rip Van Winkle and how he fell asleep and he slept for 20 years. But what we often miss is actually the most important piece of the story, which is when he went into the inn where he fell asleep, there was a sign outside that said King George III of England. And when he woke up 20 years later, the sign said George Washington, the first president of the United States. And he literally had slept through the revolution. And so Dr. King said in 1965, there's a revolution happening in the world. We need to not sleep through the revolution. And I think what's really critically important for our Jewish community to understand right now, on one hand, our community is incredibly focused, and rightfully so, on sustaining itself. A community with so much generational trauma, with the threat of extermination in recent memory, has to be committed to sustaining itself. And that brings a certain kind of conservatism with it, that we're reluctant to jump into kind of radical change because it makes us feel even more vulnerable. And at the same time, there is a revolution that's happening in this country and around the world. It is coming with a great awakening of the toxic presence of white supremacy in the building of this nation and others as well. And it's alerting us now to the fact that there is an unresolved pain in this country that if it's not reckoned with, it will not go away. And that pain is only going to morph into more human suffering. And the question is, how do we respond to that? And so, I think that in this past couple of years, as we've really seen everything at stake in our democracy, many of us have had our eyes opened to a different vision of what it would mean, not just to be conservative in the sense of conserving what works, but to really be imaginative, to think about what might be possible. What might it actually look like to live in a multiracial democracy that looks more like the demographic at Princeton's incoming class than it does like the US Senate, right? What would happen if our institutions, if our communal spaces actually reflected the true demographics of this country? And that's terrifying for some people to think about. And it's also where the future is going. And so I think this is a moment of invitation for people to think about and invest in what it would be like to be part of that great imagining that's happening now. And what is the space for the Jewish community in that future? And so instead of being resistant to change, because you cannot stop the transformation that's happening in our society, instead of trying to like hold it at bay, instead dreaming together, investing in relationships with others who, many of whom have been vulnerable minority communities who have been completely invisibilized or marginalized for many years, and thinking together from our own trauma and history and our own Jewish values about what we could contribute to that beautiful vision of a multiracial democracy. I will say that we realized in our community some years ago that if we hold the dream of building a beloved community out in the world, we had no right to do that if we weren't building the beloved community inside. And that awareness changed us. And Mitch was talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And we're all, and Julie's talking about these anti-racism efforts, and Menachem's reading cast and doing book groups. And I think part of what we're trying to do in this moment is bring this conversation into our own homes in a way that will help us catch up with what's happening out in the rest of the world, so that we don't just feel like we're being cast aside while the world moves on, but instead we are part of moving this conversation forward. And so, I want to point out, because you started by saying this, Danny, and I appreciate this, that JTS is growing in its diversity, that the current makeup of the rabbinical school at JTS looks very different than it did when I was there in the late 90s. And in the late 90s, it looked very different than it did 20 years before that. And so this means that things are moving in the right direction. But I can tell you that, there was a study that came out two years ago or so that Alana Kaufman did with other Jews of color, and they determined that 12 to 20% of the American Jewish community is made up of Jews of color. And for certain reasons of data analysis, they were not even including Persian Jews in that count. So 12 to 20% of our American Jewish community is made up of Jews of color. And then when you add the Persian community, significantly more. So I would just invite us to look at the boards of our federations, the leadership of our synagogues, of our day schools, of our camps. If we don't see that reflected, then we are behind the times, and we're not creating communities and organizations that are really fighting for the kind of justice and inclusion inside that we claim that we're fighting for on the outside. And we can be doing this work without shame and without guilt, but with a real renewed sense of purpose, because these are our Jewish values, because building a more just and inclusive community and world is core to who we are as a Jewish people. And so I invite us to take cast, which Menachem held up before, and try to read it not from a place of defensiveness, but with an open heart that says, what is there for me to learn in this moment, so that I don't wake up on the other side of this and see George Washington, President of the United States, and say, what happened? When did the world change like this? And why don't I understand a word my grandkids are saying? But instead to be part of bringing George Washington into the new leadership of that time.
Beautiful. Wow. Gosh, I wish we had time for more and more, because you all are so rich in your imagination, your leadership, your power, frankly. And we are sort of near the end of our time. So I'd hope we would also talk a little bit about personal spiritual practices, because I think, Sharon, what you were saying at the end there was so important about having an expansive vision of what our mission is and what our opportunity and our obligation, frankly, is in society, but that needs to begin within. It has to begin within our own communities, and the way that we gather, the way that we study, the way that we act in the world. And I think that is something that each of us on this call, the hundreds of people on this call, needs to be thinking, what are the spiritual practices in my own life that can allow me to be part of this change and a part of a renaissance, frankly, of the spirit, of the Jewish spirit and the American spirit, and really around the world. I don't want us to lose sight of particularism, because there is beauty to building our own specific schools and our own specific shuls and our own specific communities that know each other, and that love each other, that practice chesed towards one another, and in that strength expand the spirit to encompass other communities. And so I've actually made a little change in plans. In just a moment after I conclude this program, I've asked Menachem to pick up his guitar and sing a beautiful song that he wrote and that many of us love, that picks up on the biblical words, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, that the way to build this world into the kind of world we want to inhabit in our schools and our campuses and our shuls and our federations and our seminaries and many other wonderful places, is through the practice of chesed. So I'm going to conclude with one last sentence, thanking all of you. And I am seeing a lot of text messages. People love this, would like to hear more on this. They're taking notes. That's great. And we have a lot of partners on this. If you've scrolled through, you see a lot of people who are doing this holy work in partnership. So we're grateful for that. I want to point out that next Thursday, we also have a day of learning at JTS. 5 of our world-renowned faculty will be teaching about Sfirat HaOmer, and you don't want to miss that. Check out the link at jtsa.edu/Omer 2021. And I think Dorit's going to put a link in for that. And so thank you. And Menachem, could you take us to this place of chesed, of love?
Danny, it's my honor. And I also wanted to thank you for convening us and honor you for all of your work at JTS. I know that you're beginning a new adventure. And when I was ready to begin mine, I asked you for some advice. You might not remember the moment, but I do. And I said, I wasn't sure that I was up to a task. And you said, are you an Eved Hashem? You just turned around and said, are you in service of something greater than self? Are you trying to serve God? And so I just want to bless you that you should know in your heart how much you've done that for so many of us. So wherever you are, friends, I hope that you'll sing a little bit. And then better than that, go do something really good for somebody else. And you must build this world from love. And if we build this world from love, then God will build this world from love. Last time, Olam Chesed. Olam Chesed Yibaneh. Olam Chesed Yibaneh.
Thank you, Menachem. Shabbat shalom, everyone.